I'm Gold Derby editor Daniel Montgomery here with Tessa Thompson, who stars in Passing as Irene, whose life in 1920s New York City is upended when she reconnects with a childhood friend, now passing for white. Now you've made a few films that have explored themes of identity and social justice. Is that part of what attracted you to this story when the opportunity came?
Sure. I mean, I'm endlessly fascinated with identity in general, and certainly, I like to do work that I feel like maybe can contribute in some way to cultural conversations that are important. I was so blown away when I read the novella that our film is based on by Nella Larson. She wrote it in 1929, and it just had such modernity. I couldn't believe that it had been written so long ago and still felt kind of so current. And yes, of course, our film explores the practice of racial sort of dynamics and passing in terms of racial identity. But to me, the thing that was most astounding was the ways in which it talks about just universally our identity as humans, and ask the sort of central question: how free are any of us to construct our own ideas about who we are? And this idea that none of us fit too squarely in the boxes that we try to put ourselves in, that we're bound to sort of spill out the sides if we're being fullest expressions of ourselves. And I found it really challenging and interesting to play a woman that is passing in a lot of ways. She's living sort of upstandingly, I don't know if that's a word, as a Black woman in Harlem, is sort of a pillar of her community, is like a good mother, is all these things. And I think in very many ways is performing. That many of those things are performances for her that I found just so endlessly interesting.
And yeah, like you said, the film really goes into, different ways of passing, different ways your identity is expressed. And that's one of the things that I appreciated about it is, it's not just about anti-Black racism. It's about how individual Black people at that time and now certainly can experience their own identities, and how Irene is sort of caught in between these two worlds in a way herself.
Yeah, entirely. I would argue she's caught between many. And I think very often there's this idea as an actor that you can't play more than one thing at once, that there's this sort of clear objective. And I've always had taken issue with that, because I think as humans, we are so many things at once. But with Irene more specifically, it felt really imperative to be able to hold space for a lot of truths, sometimes ones that are conflicting. For example, I think something that's so fascinating about the dynamic between my character, Irene, and Ruth Negga's character, Claire, is that there's so much. There's longing, there's jealousy, there's the want to be close to, there's the want to destroy. There is, it's a relationship fraught with a lot of complicated and conflicting ideas and feelings.
And so much of what's going on with Irene in this film is a lot of internal, unspoken, just subtext that we read on your face in the film. What's the process of sort of getting into that mindset and capturing all of the conflict that's going on in her head and sort of conveying that through your performance?
Yeah, I don't know. It is like, it's interesting. I think something that, I was fascinated by, for my money, and Rebecca agreed with me, is in some ways it's a portrait of a woman who is becoming untethered in some ways with reality. There are filmic cues about that. For example, the first time she comes down the staircase, she sees Ruth's character and Andre Holland, who plays my husband Brian so brilliantly. She sees them in conversation, and you think that they're speaking quite close, and then she rounds the corner and you realize that they're actually quite far apart. And so that's a first sort of hint, I think, to the audience, almost in a Hitchcockian way, that maybe the person whom you're following very closely is not the most reliable source, that her perception of reality is a little bit eschewed by this depth of feeling that she has for Claire and what Claire represents in her life. And I think to play those sort of conflicting ideas, I felt really helped by a brilliant screenplay that Rebecca wrote, where she was able to communicate some of those things in filmic language that did some of the heavy lifting for me. And then also I had this brilliant book. It's 93 pages. It's so slim, but so much happens. The language is so just verbose and evocative and provocative. For example, in the first scene where you see each other for the first time in the tea room, Irene smells Claire before she sees her, and she describes the confluence of scents. And it was like fun for me to have some of those scents at the ready and be smelling them. I mean, there was so much that is on the page in Nella's book that I could continuously re-engage with. And I'm not, typically I feel like all the stuff that you would write in the margins have to first like live inside of you. It has to be an embodied experience as opposed to something that's too like didactic or scholarly. Performance should hopefully be a living, breathing thing that's spontaneous. But I had so many of Nella's words just plucked straight from my battered copy of her book, copied straight into the margins of my script, because it was helpful for me to be able to trace the thoughts and feelings that Irene was having, particularly because so many of them don't get expressed. It was almost like a subscript or a piece of music that I felt like I was getting to play with glances and with physicality. And also I think, there's so much ambiguity on the page that I think sometimes there is this idea. My dog is howling. Here he is. He's singing. It feels only right to have him be on this for a minute because he was like our set dog. But but there was so much that I think is expressed in Nella's words that it was really fun to try to articulate inside of Irene. And also I think because there's so much, as I was saying, ambiguity on the page, I think also allowing space for that, I think, was important inside of the performance. I think very often, sometimes we like, as an audience member, it can be soothing to be able to watch a character, a story, and know that we kind of understand it. We have a handle on it. And to be honest, I feel like if we had done that with this, if I had done that inside of the performance, it wouldn't really be honoring what we were trying to do and honoring Nella's work, because the thing that is so haunting about it is you're left with not entirely understanding. And particularly, I think, for Irene, who is someone who doesn't entirely understand self, doesn't entirely let herself be seen. A part of that is being available to keeping some of those secrets from the audience. And it's been really a joy to see what different audience members come up with, because the takes are really varied.
And as ambiguous as the story is, like, everything in the film feels so intentional. Was there a lot of rehearsal? Because like all the gestures and just the manners of speaking and the glances and everything feels so thought through and intentional and deliberate to convey what's going on between these characters.
Yeah, Rebecca liked the idea that the film itself is performing, that there's an element of performance even inside of the tone and timbre of the film and of the performances. So that was really intentional on our part. We shot in 23 days. We had very little time to rehearse, but we did steal some time. We spent, actually, it was right before Thanksgiving. We spent the Thanksgiving holiday together, myself and Ruth and Rebecca, holed up in her house outside of New York City. And we just talked and worked. And then when we came back into the city, just the week out from shooting, we had some days where we could sit around, myself, Andre Holland, Alexander Sarsgaard, get together and read the scenes and sort of talk about, the scenes in broad strokes. And then we had a little bit of time. Some of the scenes were very specific in terms of physicality. For example, there's some moments when, Ruth will literally take over my shot. And so there is kind of dancing, and like any dance, you sort of have to, rehearse the steps. So some of those very specific ones. Also, there was a certain level of precision that was needed just because of the aspect ratio. We're like sort of crammed in the frame. So typically, you can you have your mark, but sometimes your mark is a suggestion of where maybe you might like to be. But with this one, if you were off your mark, sometimes it meant you literally were not in the frame. And certainly for as specific as Rebecca was, not in the frame exactly where she wanted you or saw you. And in that way, it was just, kind of specific and required a certain amount of rehearsal, at least the day that we were shooting, which is fun. I really it was in that way, it was sort of the most physically precise thing I've ever done, which I really enjoyed. It felt almost athletic sometimes.
And you mentioned how the story written almost 100 years ago feels so modern in certain ways, and now telling the story in the 21st century, like, how do you feel like it sort of resonates now, and what kinds of responses are people having to it? As you said, people are having very, very many different takes.
Yeah, people are having many different takes. I mean, Rebecca wanted to make this film because she had real skin in the game. She was sort of unpacking and trying to understand her own racial identity, because she comes from a legacy of passing and has, that has been an unfolding thing for her in her life. So certainly there's been people that have told me various stories about the legacy of passing in their own family, whether it be just someone I've run into on the street, or someone that I've known for a while and didn't know that was the case. So that's been really interesting. And then I think, so much of this film is kind of about the ways in which none of us, as I said, fit too squarely in any of these boxes that we try to contain ourselves in. And I think we currently live in a time where hopefully some of those ideas around the strict constructs of race, gender, class are eroding. And so arguably, I think we have the most freedom that we've had as humans to really orient ourselves and create identities for ourselves that really match our inner world and inner life. And yet it's still so impossible to do that sometimes as a human, right? No matter sort of the structures around you. And no matter the systemic sort of landscape, it's still really hard sometimes to feel like, oh yeah, I am the fullest expression of self. I'm exactly who I want to be in the world. And so for that reason, I think there's a sort of poignancy to Nella's work that 100 years from now, I hope the film still holds up in a way. Some of the things might seem antiquated. Certainly the idea of passing racially is something that's maybe lost in a modern audience in a way that it maybe wouldn't have been. But I would say some of the themes that Nella's getting to, the universal themes, the real human themes, actually people couldn't even see 100 years ago when she wrote the book because they were kind of ahead of their time. And that's, I think, the alchemy of her work. And I hope we've made something that can sort of, stand the test of time in that way too.
And just thinking about the way this film is sort of like performing a version of yourself, it almost makes me think of now we have more freedom in certain ways than we had in the 20s, but also we live in this technological age where like we're performing a version of ourselves online all the time. Like
all the time.
Yeah, I feel like Claire would be really good at Instagram in this era.
Oh my God, she's like an early influencer, like she's sent all the things, she's invited to all the parties. Yeah, I think you're right. She would have been really fantastic at Instagram. I think Irene would be actually not unlike myself on Instagram, but mostly just like stalking people, just looking at other people's Instagram profiles. And she'd have a lot of like images saved in her saved drafts, but then never post them. I think that is more Irene's speed, which I guess I understand. I mean, it's a weird time. You're right. Arguably, we have freedom in a way to create identity, and sometimes the ways in which we do that, particularly social media, actually gets us further away from ourselves and certainly from each other.
And in addition to acting in the film, you're an executive producer, and you have been moving more into producing. You have started your own production company. What's it been like, taking sort of the reins of your work in that way, and sort of being on that creative side, and what made you want to do that?
It's been incredible. I've always kind of thought producerially, and I remember actually being on the set of Passing and having both Nini Yang Bon Jovi, who's one of our producers, and Margot Hand, who's one of our producers, say like, "You're a producer, you know that, right? Like that you think like a producer." And my producerial credit, both Ruth and I, really represented the fact that we stuck it out with the project for many years, attached ourselves to it, and by hook or by crook decided we would help get it made. But in terms of like the nitty gritty of finding financing and all of those things, all of the development process, Ruth and I were free to sort of dip in and out of that. Whereas the work that I'm doing now with my production company, Viva Mod, is like in the trenches daily, finding the money, finding the place, finding the filmmakers, every single step of the development process, which I kind of started to do anyways. I did, was there every step of the way with the development process of this film called Little Woods that I made with Mia DaCosta. And I had been doing that inside of the context of films that I was in, stories that I wanted to tell personally. And then I just felt like I, at a certain point, wanted to expand that there are stories that I want to be a part of telling, but I don't necessarily need to be on screen in them. I don't belong in front of the camera in those narratives, but I want to be instrumental in getting them made. And that's where the company was born, out of that place. I also feel so emboldened, I think, because I look at Passing, for example, and what it's done in this way of reinvigorating interest and curiosity around Nella Larsen's work, for example, who was so unsung in her time. And I think about so many brilliant writers now. I want them to be canon now. I don't want to have to wait 100 years for people to be talking about the work of Raven Leilani or Disha Filia or Nafisa Thompson Spires. So many of these authors now, with the projects that I have set up both at HBO Max, or some of the things I'm doing in film, it's really wanting to tell these stories now, not wanting to wait, wanting to change the aperture around the kind of protagonists that we get, the kind of stories that we decide are important, that are worth our money and our time. And that has been such a dream for me. It's been a real gift to get to really lean in and focus on that. And I have so many friends that I admire, who are both, talent, but also have companies, and I, look to them as just sources of inspiration.
Well, I want to congratulate you on your work in this film, and all the work to come. And with your production company, I look forward to seeing everything you guys put out, and seeing more different kinds of stories from different people. So it's been a pleasure.
The pleasure's been mine. Thanks so much for having me.